The house was quiet in the way it always became right after his voice filled the room. Not shouting exactly, but sharp enough to cut through everything else. I remember standing still, my hands at my sides, eyes fixed on a spot on the wall just past his shoulder. I wasn't looking at him. I had learned not to. Looking made things feel worse. Looking felt like answering back, even when no words came out. He was angry about something small. It always started that way. A tone, a look, a question that wasn't really a question. I didn't understand what I had done wrong. Not fully, but I understood the danger of not understanding fast enough. So I stayed quiet. I nodded when it seemed right. I waited for it to pass. That moment is still clear to me, even now, not because of what was said, but because of what followed, the silence afterward. The air felt heavier, like it had settled on my chest. I remember the sound of the clock in the other room, the hum of the refrigerator, normal sounds that suddenly felt too loud. Nothing physical happened, it didn't have to. The lesson had already landed. That was how discipline worked in our home. It didn't need explanations. It didn't invite questions. It didn't ask how you felt. It only required one thing: obedience. As a child, I didn't think to question it. None of us did. This was just how things were. Rules were rules. Adults knew better. Kids listened. That was the order of things. And breaking that order carried a weight you learned to fear early. I didn't feel angry in that moment. I felt small, careful, aware of every breath. I felt the familiar pull inward, the quiet decision to disappear just enough to avoid making things worse. Looking back now, I can see how early that habit formed, how quickly silence became a skill, how easily I learned to accept discipline without understanding and to confuse control with care. At the time, though, it felt normal. It felt like growing up. Our house looked like 100 others on the block. Nothing about it stood out. A modest place in a quiet American neighborhood where lawns were trimmed on Saturdays and people waved from their driveways. From the outside, there was nothing that hinted at the tension inside. No shouting spilling through open windows, no slammed doors. Everything appeared orderly. Inside, order was everything. There were rules for how we spoke, how we sat, how we moved through the house. You didn't interrupt, you didn't question, you didn't linger where you weren't needed. You learned to listen for footsteps, you learned the meaning of certain sounds. A drawer closing, a chair moving, the shift in the air that told you someone was displeased. Time moved differently in that house. Waiting took up most of it. Waiting to be called, waiting to be dismissed, waiting to see what kind of mood the day would bring. Even joy felt cautious, like it needed permission. School wasn't much different. Authority was authority, whether it wore a tie or stood behind a podium. You followed instructions, you kept your head down, you did what was expected. Praise came rarely, but correction came quickly. You learned which one mattered more. I don't remember many conversations about feelings, not because they never happened, but because they weren't important enough to stick. What stayed with me were the rules, clear, unmoving, safe in their own way. If you followed them, you avoided trouble. If you didn't, you learned quickly why you should have. Fear wasn't loud, it was quiet and constant. It sat in the background of everything, shaping choices before you even realized you were making them. It taught you to anticipate reactions instead of expressing yourself, to measure every word before speaking, or to choose silence instead. As a child, I thought this was strength. I thought this was discipline. I thought this was what prepared you for the real world. I didn't know yet what it would cost.
The moment that changed everything didn't look dramatic from the outside. There was no scene you could point to and say, that's when it broke. If you had walked past our house that day, you wouldn't have noticed anything unusual. No raised voices carrying through the walls, no doors slamming, no neighbors pausing to listen. Inside, though, something shifted. It started like many other moments. A small mistake, something ordinary. I don't even remember exactly what it was now, and that feels important. Whatever it wasn't worth remembering, but the response was. I remember being called into the room. His voice was steady but tight. That tone meant something serious was coming. I stood where I was told, feet planted, hands still. I kept my eyes low, not out of defiance, but because I had learned that eye contact could be taken the wrong way. Too much looked like challenge, too little looked like guilt. You learn to balance somewhere in between. He spoke slowly, carefully. Each word felt measured, like it had weight. There was disappointment in his voice, and something else too. Frustration, maybe? Or fear. At the time, I didn't know how to name it. I only knew that it made my chest feel tight. He didn't ask me why. He didn't ask what I was thinking. He told me what I had done wrong. He told me what it said about me. He told me what he expected instead. The rules were clear. They always were. What wasn't clear was how I was supposed to feel. I wanted to explain, not to argue, just to make things clearer, to say that I hadn't meant it the way he thought, that I hadn't seen it coming, that I was still learning. The words were right there, sitting behind my teeth, but they never made it out, because somewhere deep inside a familiar warning surfaced. Speaking might make it worse. So I stayed quiet. That silence felt different this time. It wasn't just obedience. It wasn't just waiting for the moment to pass. It felt like something folding inward, like a door closing slowly, carefully, so it wouldn't make a sound. He continued, his voice calm but firm. There was no cruelty in it, no rage. That almost made it harder. It felt final, certain, as if the verdict had already been decided and nothing I said could change it. I nodded when it seemed right. I absorbed what was said without pushing back. I let the moment move through me instead of against me. On the outside, I looked composed. On the inside, something was rearranging itself. I remember thinking, this is how it works. This is how you stay safe. This is how you survive. When it was over, he turned away. Not sharply, just finished. The conversation, such as it was, had reached its end. I was dismissed without ceremony. I stood there for a second longer than necessary. The room felt empty, even though I was still in it. The air was thick, quiet, pressed in from all sides. I could hear my own breathing, slower than it should have been, like I was trying not to disturb anything. I walked away carefully, as if sudden movement might reopen the moment. Later that day, nothing else happened. That was the strangest part. No follow-up, no conversation, no reassurance. Life continued as normal. Dinner was eaten, the television was turned on, doors were closed for the night. But inside me, something had changed shape. Before that moment, silence had been a strategy, a way to avoid trouble. After that moment, it became something else, a default, a reflex, a rule I carried with me even when no one was watching. I began to understand that obedience wasn't just about following instructions. It was about making yourself smaller so there was no friction, no resistance, no reason for correction. I didn't feel angry at my father. I didn't feel resentful. What I felt was careful, alert, tuned in to every shift in tone, every pause, every unspoken signal. That moment taught me how powerful words could be even when they weren't loud, how discipline didn't need force to leave a mark, how understanding wasn't required for obedience to take hold. I carried that lesson with me quietly. At school, I spoke less. I answered questions only when called on. I avoided attention. Teachers saw me as respectful, well-behaved, easy. No one worried about a kid who didn't cause problems. At home, I moved through rooms like a guest. I didn't linger. I didn't ask. I waited to be addressed. I measured my tone even when speaking about small things. I learned that neutral was safest. Inside, though, thoughts piled up, questions that went unasked, feelings that had nowhere to go, confusion that I didn't yet have words for. That defining moment wasn't loud or violent or obvious. It was quiet, controlled, acceptable by every standard I knew at the time. And that was exactly why it stayed with me, because it taught me that you could do everything right on the outside and still lose something important on the inside.
After that moment, nothing was officially different. There were no new rules written down, no changes announced. The house still ran the same way it always had. Meals happened at the same time, the television volume stayed low, doors were closed gently, schedules were followed. From the outside, everything looked steady, but inside me, the quiet began to stretch. I noticed it first in small ways. I stopped telling stories, not because I didn't have any, but because I wasn't sure which parts were safe to share. I would start to speak, then stop halfway through a sentence, deciding it was better left unsaid. Silence felt cleaner, safer. It didn't invite correction. I listened more than I talked. I watched faces. I studied moods the way other kids studied homework. I learned the difference between a tired sigh and an irritated one, between a neutral look and a warning look. I learned how to adjust myself before anyone asked. At home, I stayed in my room longer, not hiding exactly, just contained. My room became a place where I could think without being seen thinking. I sat on my bed and let time pass. Sometimes I stared at the wall. Sometimes I replayed conversations in my head, searching for where I might have gone wrong, even where nothing had happened. When my father spoke, I listened carefully. I answered when spoken to. I kept my voice even. I didn't rush, I didn't linger. I learned how to end conversations politely and quickly. That way, there was less chance of misunderstanding. There were moments when he tried to connect. I see that now. A question asked at dinner, a comment about school, a suggestion about the future. At the time, those moments made me tense instead of comforted. I didn't know how to respond without risking something, so I gave short answers, safe answers, answers that couldn't be taken the wrong way. Over time, the space between us grew, not from anger, but from caution. I didn't stop caring. I didn't stop wanting approval. If anything, I wanted it more. But I learned that wanting quietly was better than wanting out loud. Desire, like everything else, had to be managed. At school, teachers praised my behavior. They used words like mature and respectful. I didn't interrupt. I didn't argue. I didn't push back. Other kids got in trouble. I didn't. Adults liked that. They didn't see the cost. Friendships became complicated. I didn't know how to let people get close. I listened to their problems, I helped when I could, but I didn't share much of myself. I didn't want to explain things I didn't fully understand. I didn't want questions I couldn't answer. When someone asked how things were at home, I said, fine. That answer became automatic. It covered everything and nothing at the same time. Inside, emotions started to flatten. Not disappear, just quiet down. Excitement felt risky. Anger felt dangerous. Even joy felt like it might draw attention. So I learned to keep everything at a manageable level. I followed rules even when no one was watching. I felt uneasy breaking small ones, even harmless ones. The idea of being corrected, even gently, made my stomach tighten. I didn't want to be noticed for the wrong reason. Trust changed shape too. I trusted systems more than people, rules more than conversations, clear expectations more than emotional closeness. Rules didn't misunderstand you. Rules didn't change their tone. At home, I stopped asking questions. Not just big ones, but small ones too. If I didn't know something, I figured it out on my own. If I was unsure, I stayed quiet. Asking felt like drawing attention to yourself, and attention felt unsafe. There were nights when I lay awake listening to the house settle, the hum of appliances, the soft creak of the floor. Those sounds were steady, predictable. They didn't judge. I preferred them to voices. I remember thinking that this was what growing up meant, becoming quieter, more controlled, less in the way. I thought I was doing well. I thought this was maturity. But something else was happening too. I started to feel distant from myself. I had thoughts I didn't follow, feelings I didn't explore. I didn't know how to explain what I wanted or needed, even to myself. It was easier to focus on what was expected. Obedience became automatic, not because I agreed with everything, but because it felt safer than uncertainty. I didn't weigh choices emotionally, I weighed consequences. There were moments when I wanted comfort, not correction, just a sense that it was okay to be confused, okay to make mistakes. But I didn't know how to ask for that, and I wasn't sure it was something you were supposed to ask for. So I adapted. I learned how to disappear in plain sight, to be present without taking up space, to meet expectations without revealing too much of myself. From the outside, I looked calm. Inside, I was careful. The silence wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself. It settled in slowly, like dust, covering things over time until you forgot what was underneath. That silence followed me as I grew older, into new rooms, new relationships, new responsibilities. I carried it with me without realizing it was optional. I thought everyone lived this way, measuring words, editing feelings, holding back just enough to stay safe. It took years before I realized what I had learned wasn't just discipline, it was distance. And once distance becomes familiar, closeness can feel foreign. That was the aftermath. Not chaos, not rebellion, just quiet. Long, careful quiet.
As an adult, I didn't recognize the silence right away. It didn't announce itself as a problem. It showed up as habits that felt normal. I was reliable, responsible, calm under pressure. People trusted me. They said I was steady. They said I didn't overreact. I took those words as compliments. But there were moments, usually late at night, when the quiet came back in a familiar way. Not peaceful, just empty. I would sit alone and feel like something was missing, without being able to name it. I had done everything right. I had followed the rules. I had built a life that looked solid. And still, something felt distant. Over time, I began to notice patterns. I avoided conflict even when it mattered. I apologized quickly, sometimes without knowing why. I struggled to ask for help. When someone raised their voice, even slightly, my body reacted before my mind did. My chest tightened, my thoughts narrowed. I became careful again. That was when I started to understand that the discipline I grew up with had taught me important things. It taught me structure, responsibility, awareness. It helped me survive a world that expects control. Those lessons stayed with me, and they weren't all bad. But discipline had also taken something quietly. It took my comfort with being imperfect, my ease with speaking freely, my belief that closeness didn't require caution. I learned how to behave, but I didn't learn how to be seen. When I thought about my father, my feelings were complicated. I didn't see him as cruel. I didn't see him as unloving. I saw a man who believed deeply in rules because rules felt safe to him. A man who thought guidance had to be firm to be effective. A man who was likely raised the same way, carrying forward what he knew. Understanding that didn't erase the impact, but it softened it. I realized that he taught obedience because he thought it would protect me, and in some ways it did. But it also taught me to shrink myself to fit expectations, to trade expression for approval, to choose silence over connection. As I got older, I began the slow work of unlearning some of that, not rejecting discipline, but balancing it, allowing myself to speak even when my voice felt uncertain, letting mistakes exist without punishment, learning that disagreement doesn't always lead to rejection. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet work. Small choices. Saying one honest sentence. Staying in a conversation a little longer than felt comfortable. Noticing when I was holding my breath and choosing to exhale instead. The silence didn't disappear overnight, but it loosened. I began to see that obedience had been a skill, not an identity.
that I could keep what helped me and release what kept me distant, that rules can guide behavior, but they don't have to define worth. Looking back now, I don't feel anger. I feel clarity. I can name what happened without blaming anyone. I can acknowledge the lessons without denying the cost. What was taken wasn't my future. It was my voice for a time, and voices can be found again. If any part of this feels familiar, you're not alone. Many of us grew up learning how to behave long before we learned how to express ourselves. We learned how to listen, how to wait, how to follow, and sometimes we're still learning how to speak. If you feel comfortable, you might take a moment to think about the rules you grew up with, the ones you accepted without question. Which ones helped you? And which ones taught you to stay quiet when you didn't need to? If you want to share, you're welcome to leave a memory or a thought in the comments. Not to explain everything, just to be heard, maybe in a way you weren't before.